Kick off. We've got good 30. Okay. So good afternoon, guys, and welcome to a very, very special webinar today. We have the legend himself of Tim Burrowes.
I thought you were going to say Dominic.
No, well, I'll get to him.
I don't pay him enough.
We've got Tim, whose reputation precedes him, so I won't give him too much of a big head, but he's a legend of the industry, and he's come to talk to us about all things media today. He's got his hand in a few different things, which he'll explain at the moment. The great Dominic Pearman is going to be conducting the interview today. Dom, who is founder of the IMAA, the first chairman, director, and also Pearman Media, has been around for 1,000 years of experience. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dom to do a proper introduction and to kick things off. Dom, over to you.
Great. Okay, thanks, Sam. Well, Tim, first, welcome to the world of independence. So on this call, I think you'll find that the IMAA has the most experience, the most stable, the longest employed people in advertising, and certainly if they haven't read your book, I'm sure they would really enjoy reading it. I found it. Steve Allen gave me a copy, and I found it really easy to read. It's in by chapter, so you can pick it up and put it down. And frankly, most of the people on this call have probably lived through everything you've written about, which is basically from 2010 onwards. So I guess just to cover a little bit, you've been editor of B&T, you founded Mumbrella, you've written this book, sort of Media Unmade, and now you've got your own Unmade EDM, which again, if anybody sort of viewing hasn't got onto it, it's well worth subscribing. As you rightly point out, Tim, it's fairly cheap at this stage, so we should do it sooner rather than later.
Get in before the price goes up at the weekend.
Exactly. So I guess probably the first question is, throughout all that history that you've got in media in Australia, what's the most interesting story you've covered in that time?
Oh gosh, look, you probably get the big stories of sort of the thematic stuff, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. Just the great disruptional changes that digital has taken to every aspect of media. So I suppose overall that's the one big one, and then I think the one that certainly was the most interesting being involved in, and probably generated the most industry comment, was when we began to look closely, and we did it a couple of different periods, sometimes about specific agencies and sometimes more widely, but around the kind of the relationship between the industry and awards, and the kind of the extent that agencies would go to win them, and sometimes it was it was, as they say, the truth well told, or possibly well sold, and sometimes it went way beyond that. So there were a couple of times where obviously we kind of talked about specific agencies, and it really became sort of quite a demanding piece of kind of investigative journalism to get up in the first place, but then quite agenda setting. So that was probably the most sort of, certainly in my times with Mumbrella, was among the most interesting sort of topics.
Right. Okay. And with the book, as I say, like I've really enjoyed reading it. My favourite was chapter 16, where you sort of titled it "Today is Yesterday." I don't know how long it took you to think that one up, but and that was a story about Kieran Davis sort of signing up Kyle Sandilands and basically changing the face of ARN. From your point of view, do you have a particular favourite within the book? Was there a particular story which was difficult to get hold of, or was there a juicy one you've left out?
Look, I suppose sometimes it's the little kind of nuggets or piece of minutiae that you really have to chase down just to sort of to pull it out and check that you're right. So sometimes it's quite minor things, So I sort of there was what I would try and start each chapter with is something which was a bit more first person, something I actually saw for myself, or generally I was in the room for, or whatever. So one of those was just being at the kind of the launch for the new kind of programming lineup with Nova, and this was just as Lachlan Murdoch had taken over, and it was kind of his first experience there, and they organized for kind of, Evermore as a sort of surprise. They were hiding behind the curtains. They did the big announcement. The curtains were supposed to drop and they'd start. And it all went very Spinal Tap when the curtains wouldn't open. And we were literally taking it turns to go up and just peer through the curtains at the band playing. And I was there for it, but it was also 10 years ago. So just trying to make sure I'd remembered it right, tracking down the number of people who were there, because you're trying to talk about who's there. So you're tracking down old Getty Images photographs from the party on the night to see who, which talent were there. So you're piecing together quite a lot just to tell a amusing little anecdote. So that was a sort of thing that was probably the most sort of fun stuff to do, was those kind of quirky moments around it. But equally, an awful lot was just tracking down so many people, not many of whom aren't still in the industry anymore, although that tended to mean they're also a lot more comfortable telling me what really happened as well. But an awful lot of it was just I might have been writing about it at the time, but obviously that's just, you don't have the whole picture at the time. And when you go back and talk to people, then you can get there. So just little details, like there were probably half a dozen or maybe 10 people in the room when Kim Williams told his team that he was going to have to leave News because of the fallings out with the editors, and the fact that he broke down in tears in that conversation. You want to make sure you're getting your facts right to be able to tell that sort of detail. So a lot of it is just making sure that you've chased down everything you possibly can.
Yeah. Okay. I guess having spent that time on Umbrella, that's helped a lot too, because I've noticed in the book you do a lot of quotes from Umbrella and sort of different events that Umbrella held. So it's pieced together.
Yes, it was very helpful just having that kind of trove of video as much as anything, because it's one thing to have interviewed someone on stage 5 years ago or 10 years ago sometimes, but it's another thing being able to watch it again and just have it all sort of fresh in the mind. Anthony
Catalano, is he an astute businessman or an opportunist?
That's a really tricky one, because I suspect it's a little bit of both. He's obviously a deal maker. He's very charismatic. People who've worked with him have strong feelings, positively or negatively. So, he's built this massive band of supporters, but also, his kind of professional enemies as well. He as I quoted him in the book, he said himself that when he left Fairfax for the first time in the sort of the cull of around 2009, that was as much as anything because of his challenging relationships with other members of the Fairfax management at the time, as it was a genuine redundancy. But he is very, very good in the niche he was and is in, which is real estate. The business of real estate media. I suppose if there's one theme of the book, it's the winners all have domain expertise. They know their world incredibly well. And where he had his domain expertise was in real estate and the relationships between media owners and the real estate agents, and how to turn that into a new business model, which was was where he sort of made his first fortune, by going out and building that publication in Melbourne around that, beginning to take Fairfax's real estate advertising, until Fairfax came back to him and brought him back in the stable, and in effect made him the biggest shareholder in Fairfax, which he then, when he fell out and left Fairfax again, then pivoted to being take that fortune and use it to buy Australian Community Media, where I think now the big question is, can he turn that sort of domain expertise around real estate? The open question is, can he widen it to classifieds generally? So can Real Estate View become view.com.au and become the regional player in cars or jobs or whatever. And I think that's some of the name of the game of probably what he's up to there. And that will be the real test: is he, is he able to widen his business abilities when it comes outside of the domain he lived in for so long?
Okay. I guess, of talking of winners, do you see any particular winners in media next year? Like, who are the winners and the losers? And perhaps in the same question, because you analyse all the media so in-depthly, do you, if that's a word, do you predict any mergers, acquisitions coming up?
Yeah, look, I think when we think about sort of who's least likely to be still in the same sort of position in a year's time or 2 years' time as now, you can certainly point to some people who just status quo seems unlikely. So of the big players, I'd say Seven is one of those. Obviously, James Warburton has come in and he's pretty much got the debt under control, and it was looking pretty bad when he arrived. Now, being able to, and put off the Olympic costs until this financial year probably makes their last set of numbers look better than this set will, because the Olympic costs will drop. Now, you've got a few different factors with Seven. You've got the lack of a paid streaming subscription play, and that's a big hole for a TV company, so they need to address that. You've also got the fact that the Prime affiliate deal runs out in 2 years, so that creates some interesting dynamics as well. So I think we're going to see a sort of bit of a tap dance involving, in some way, kind of on the, I guess on the Metro side, Viacom CBS as owner of 10, and Seven West Media as owner of 7. And then their affiliate arrangements with Southern Cross Stereo and with Prime. Southern Cross Stereo seem to want to be a seller of their TV assets. Viacom CBS are making noises about maybe being willing to, pick up an affiliate at the right price. Doesn't automatically have to be Southern Cross, though. It could be Prime. And then you've got the different motivations, Southern Cross Stereo, I think, just want to get out of television because they see audio as their future. Whereas Prime is a little bit more, in the book I quoted John Hardigan as calling it a billionaire's plaything, or a plaything of billionaire elephants. So you've almost got two things going on with Prime. One, of course, is just, the TV business, and it's actually got some, it ended up delivering a surplus this year, so it's got some money sitting in. I think, if I understand rightly, it's also got quite a lot of franking credits, which could be interesting for someone like Anthony Catalano and his partner Alice Waistlist, that goes beyond just as a TV asset. Because if that can then they can get to the point where they manage a takeover and they're creeping up the register, then that could be quite a nice vehicle for it, just through financial engineering, because of that side of things. I think Seven will be involved in some way. Southern Cross Stereo will, Prime will, probably then, by extension, Viacom CBS, and then sitting off on the edge, of course, you've got HT&E, who, to a certain extent, I think Kieran Davis, as CEO, is going to need to kind of sit on his hands until he's resolved the court case with the tax office over the disposal of the New Zealand newspapers, because that could be where, at the moment they've effectively got, a bill that could be $100 million, could be in the middle of 50, or it could be nothing at all. But either way, there's a pile of money sitting at HT&E, and if that becomes available to them, then that makes them potentially quite a big player. But also, because they're very pure players, an audio company these days, quite an interesting asset to pick up as well. So there are so many different kind of sort of moving parts. And then, of course, there's just the question for all these big global streaming players, because of Australia's anti-siphoning rules, the attraction of a free-to-air TV network is often access to sporting rights that that will be the only way in. So that creates a really intriguing factor as well. So I'm very anti making predictions, but I'm going to foolishly make one. So this will probably be the only one I make and the only one that proves to be wrong, which is I can't see Nine being a big part in it. I think they're quite settled. So they're the one major player it doesn't feel like is going to be a big player in it. So having made that specific prediction, that'll probably be the only thing that's wrong.
Okay, well, just on the big streamers, I mean, do you think Netflix is a sort of a debt-ridden house of cards, or do you think that it will have to bring in advertising at some stage?
Yeah, that's really interesting because, of course, the usual rational rules don't apply when you come to venture capital money out of West Coast USA. So, as you say, Netflix has huge debts. They don't report their losses in the way that many other similar media players would. So, they can drop a huge amount on, a series that's a bust, and you won't see them write down the value of that series. They'll just keep it in their assets. So it's a little hard to draw the real picture of their real health, but clearly they are a huge player. They're very, very well run. And they're one of the few global players that has genuinely made the pivot to global production. So, hey, look, the brilliant example at the moment is Squid Game, of course, where they're now capitalizing on the fact that they're not just producing stuff in the US, they're producing it around the world and at scale and making it work in other markets, which is a different dynamic to the other streamers. But one of the things we've seen over the last decade is, for a lot of these VC funded media companies, gravity has caught up in the end, so, the classic example was, the scale BuzzFeed reached in Australia and then had to scale right down when the money dried up in the US. And, that's certainly not the only VC funded company that's going to happen with.
Yeah. Okay. Just something that probably interests the audience here is, I guess, your take on independent agencies versus consortiums. You had 13 years at Umbrella. It'd be great to understand how the consortiums, sort of communicate, with trade media versus the indies.
Yeah, and look, it's worth. I guess I'm also coming up for, in fact, I think it will be about now, actually, that I'll have hit the 20-year anniversary of writing about this industry. So when I was editor of Media Week in the UK, the focus there was very much on the business of media. So media agencies were right at the heart of it. It wasn't as wide a footprint as, say, Umbrella is over here, where it, looks at sort of the marketing world and the PR world and all the other things as well. So I suppose by the time I started writing about the media agency world, the first kind of wave of standalone media agencies had just happened, and the sort of first wave of consolidation had. But we were at that point where, if you go in and see PhD, it would be the D of Jonathan Durden that you'd actually be meeting, or, sort of back in those days, Media Edge CIA, the CI of Chris Ingram Associates, it would still be Chris Ingram was still around, and so on. So it was that it was just to that point where it was all beginning to sort of come together, and at that point, and I would say until maybe 5 years ago, I would have said that the days of the media independent were probably numbered. It felt like, I beg your pardon?
Glad you got that wrong.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But I think what was beginning to strike me was it was going to get harder and harder to reach scale because of the challenges around data and technology. It felt like you needed almost a global alignment to be able just to afford to play. It felt like table stakes got more and more expensive. But actually, it feels like we hit that point, and then we've started coming down the other side. And, it actually isn't, cripplingly expensive for a media agency to play in that game now. So that I think was probably a factor I hadn't particularly seen coming. So so it does feel like what that probably means is, media companies as businesses, media agencies as independent businesses can be quite attractive. What I don't yet see is what will drive another round of acquisitions and consolidations from the big players, because mostly they seem to be about reducing their number of brands. They all ended up with these 3 or 4 brands, and they've look at something like WPP where they've sort of constricted again. So I wonder whether that actually means that the conveyor belt of independents ending up aligned to the major holding companies, if not forever cancelled, is perhaps postponed at the moment. Certainly that feels like a factor. And then in terms of how agencies talk to the trade press, look, I mean, even I'd say it's not even so much as a sector thing as it is. Some of them are very good at it, and some of them aren't. That's true on the holding company side, and generally they can put a bit more resource into communications and stuff. But it's also true on the independents as well. So I think probably on the independent side, though, the style of that communication is much more set at kind of CEO or senior management level.
Yeah. Well, it's one thing that the IMAA has done, I think, successfully. Well, there's a number of things it's done successfully, but one thing is that it's given the trade media a voice or people to go to. I know that Darren Woolley said to me, he knew exactly who to go to for consortiums, but there's just so many indies, he didn't know where to go. So that's certainly been a benefit. Just on trade media, I guess it's a bit of a bugbear I have, but years gone by, you must have had so many more journalists than actually work in trade media now. We had, came out once a week or once a fortnight. They're in-depth stories, a bit like what you do now. And now, though, there's absolute constant content that people have to produce on a daily basis. And it seems to me that then you actually go and get a lot of people who are giving their opinions, and to be frank, their opinions probably shouldn't be put in print online. And there's a classic example last week with Mumbrella, the 10 upfronts. Thankfully, there was a lot of comments, but the comments mainly from the consortiums. They had examples, like people were saying that, they ran this commentary about 10's upfronts, and they said things like 10 were balancing tried and tested programming. They delivered in spades from an audience point of view, and will maintain their audience. But 10's audience has gone back 40% in the peak time, and the programs that they put up, like Gogglebox or like MasterChef, have all gone backwards, year to year. So my point being is trade media in a bad place where they're allowing people to quote, not checking those quotes, and there must be so much pressure on getting content, they just run them. But is it bad for the advertising industry?
Yeah, look, I suppose one of the things I find myself thinking about is, before writing about media, for about 6 or 7 years, I worked on a publication which I ended up editing called Hospital Doctor. So that was in the UK. So the audience was broadly consultants working for the NHS, National Health Service in the UK. And I was struck even then by how often people would tell us how frustrating it was that one of our journalists would get to know them on the beat, and then they'd move on to another job or within the title or whatever. So I think to some extent there's always been an issue within trade press of whatever the trade, that the journos, and unless they happen to stay in that particular niche for many, many years, which is the exception, the journos tend to move on faster than the people they're writing about. So they tend to find themselves writing for people who actually have more expertise than they do. So that's a challenge, I think, of the trade press of all flavours. Now, the best of the trade press obviously does find ways of retaining people who keep the expertise, keep the corporate memory, and that goes on for hopefully multiple years or a decade or two. Or when people do move, you want them to move within that world, so it's not lost. But I suppose the big disruptive factor for the trade press was, in those days of Hospital Doctor, I mean, we were a whole floor of people, of journalists, of sub-editors, of salespeople, all of those things. So it's a very expensive operation, but also it was lucrative because there was a lot of pharmaceutical money around, and we were doing 100 pages a week, in the print edition. So it was profitable, but that was just as the internet was beginning to come through, and of course, what that did was it removed barriers for people to come in. So, I guess that's one of the things that allowed me to come through as Mumbrella was the rise of WordPress meant suddenly web publishing became cheap, sending emails suddenly became cheap at about that same moment as well. And social media was actually a good way of distribution. So, so in terms of a sort of barrier, it meant that people didn't have to put their house on the line just to publish the first edition of a magazine, for instance.
I guess the issue is though that there's so much pressure on content, constant content, so every single day that are we now as an industry being fed stuff, like people saying that so Channel 10 is delivering in spades as in an audience point of view. Like, isn't it just dangerous that and I suppose if you're a journo at sort of, the various trade media, you're probably desperate for content, so you basically just run it.
Yeah, look, there's probably a couple of things going on there, and it's probably worth being clear that although they've very kindly given me the title of editor at large, don't think of me as being a spokesperson for Mumbrella, because I'm not on staff anymore. So I think take these as observations about the trade press as a whole. Look, I think in the end, the audience builds up its trust in the titles, or maybe even the individual journalists, that they actually start to come to appreciate that they've got an insight or whatever it is. So I suspect that is one thing we're moving towards, is slightly more individual journalists, almost as brands, I suppose, is where the trust then maybe lies. And I even find that when I'm reading other trade press, I will look for the byline as well as the actual piece. But yeah, you're right that the model at the moment probably overly supports republishing press releases.
It probably favours you though, because you come out with a more in-depth, which years gone by, when Ad News was fortnightly, you had in-depth articles. So questions come in from Michael, which basically talks about the comments. I was going to ask you about that because at Mumbrella, I guess you guys introduced the anonymous comments. I got to admit, as when we launched the IMAA, we got hammered by Mumbrella with lots of anonymous comments. But also maybe do anonymous comments keep accuracy going, and obviously you've got things like Scott ScoMo basically coming out and sort of saying that Facebook should be liable for anonymous comments. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts around anonymous comments?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things is, if you were to make a time machine and look at, well, you don't need a time machine, you can look at them because they're still there. If you look at the comments on Mumbrella articles of about 10, 11, 12 years ago, it's a really high quality of debate generally. It tended to be people who were passionate and knowledgeable. And gradually over time, I think there were wider trends in just the world of commenting generally that drove down the quality. Now, one of the things for the trade press or anyone else who takes comments is, unless you are one of the digital platforms, so a Facebook or a Google, you always were, responsible as the publisher. So the legal risk always sat with, in case we're talking about Mumbrella. So it was before I left that we took the decision to turn it off. Although by then I wasn't on the news desk. I suppose one of the things that concerned me and still concerns me is you need quite a lot of experience to moderate comments well. Just to, even before you get into tone and the rights and wrongs of anonymous comments, just the risk involved for a publisher because of issues around potential defamation. And hey, look, Mumbrella's audience was a pretty clever audience at sneaking something through. So, they sometimes you just get somebody would pick a name that was actually alluding to, I don't know, the alleged misdemeanors of the person they were talking about, that you could never know unless you were closer to the story. So there was always that danger and risk. But for a long time, it was a balance.
Can you insist that the comments have a name behind them and they're not anonymous? Or?
Well, one of the issues with that was I never figured out a way of making that actually work. As you would know, it takes 1 minute to find yourself a burner email address. So unless you're literally, doing something like, and that's the thing. I'm hesitating because there's no absolute way of genuinely proving an email address. So that was always one problem, was that felt like, you could ask for email addresses, for instance, and maybe that would filter out some of them. But also the other concern, which was a legitimate one, I think, was the risk that what would happen would be the people who could freely speak were the bosses, because they didn't have to worry about the career consequences. But if you were a media salesperson, then no matter how legit, it would be a career limiting thing to criticize a media agency, for instance. No matter how legit. So that was always one of the issues. So so by the time, and honestly, by the time we switched it off, it just you spend. It was too much of a, being pragmatic from the editorial side, it was too much of a distraction. You'd spend too much time worrying about it versus the value it was driving. So it probably said something about where we have got to or had got to in social media. But I miss them. Hey, look, at the moment we do have comments on Unmade, and because it's people who've already signed up for the email and they're not stumbling on the website, so far it's pretty high quality commentary. That might change, but at the moment it feels a bit like the early days of Mumbrella, in that there are some good conversations going on.
Okay, we've only got a minute or two left, but just quickly on Facebook and Google, obviously they haven't had the world's best PR for the last couple of years, and as one of your latest articles shows, there's litigation in the States against Google. Facebook's copping a lot, and again, I know you don't like making predictions, but 20 years time, how does it look? Are they still around? I mean, it's
hey, look, I think it's a pretty good guess they'll have been broken up in some way, and that's not even that bad a thing for them. Shareholders usually get quite good value when companies are broken up, but I think more and more, the authorities here in Australia, in the US, are demonstrating that, to take the Google example, having the power of both the power of the Chrome browser and the power of having influence over every stage of the programmatic chain, and the power of holding YouTube and then running the only kind of advertising system that sits over YouTube. And then on top of that, the power of search and so on. If this was a bunch of different companies, then YouTube would have launched its own search engine by now. Probably Google would have launched its own video platform by now, and so on. So I think that will probably happen. You're sort of beginning to see the logic. I suspect that one of the things we're seeing about this potential rebrand of Facebook with, a sort of parent company, then individual things, is one day we may see WhatsApp go one way and Facebook another and Instagram another. Probably it will be forced upon them by probably the US authorities, and I think actually the shareholders will thank them for it, because they'll actually end up with a more valuable series of holdings as a result. So yeah, I think the moment is coming where some of the power will get broken up, but it's just going to take a while before we get there.
Yeah. Okay. Tim, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Maybe one last question. What's your favorite writing track? Because I've got to admit, I've occasionally asked my Amazon, actually we'll probably start talking now, but asked Amazon to play it, whatever track you've suggested.
Do you know what? If I could just only play one album for the rest of the time, then it would, predictably enough, it'd be Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. So yes, I must admit, there's many a time where, one album's finished and then Bruce Springsteen has come on afterwards. But if I just said that every single time, it would get very, very predictable. So yes. And for those who haven't yet subscribed, to explain what Dominic's talking about, I usually do mention what my writing soundtrack for the day is. But and yes, please just go to unmade.media for the URL. It's just that, unmade.media, and sign up.
And yet, thank you very much for your time, Tim. And I can definitely sort of say that it's worth signing up to at the moment. At $144 for the year, it's better value than all the other trade media. I can definitely say.
Well, you were very kind, and if you're not sure, then try out the free tier to start off with.
Yeah. Sam, over to you.
Look, just wrapping up, thank you everyone for tuning in. I found that quite very interesting. I could probably listen to it for the rest of the day. And I'm sure we would all have questions to ask you about the last couple of years. But thank you so much for giving up your time, Tim and Dom. Thank you very much for conducting the questions.